Okay, thank you very much. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Terry Pastika is the Executive Director for the Citizens Advocacy Center located in Elmhurst. And she has a lot of experience with organizations such as ours. I know she has helped this organization on many issues over the years. And I'm going to let Terry tell you a little bit about that organization and speak to us tonight on our form of government and being in an organization such as CUNFP. Terry, thank you very much.
My name is Terry. I represent an organization called the Citizen. Can I walk around, Stu?
You sure can.
I'm Italian. I speak with my arms. My organization is Citizen Advocacy Center. Hello. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, community-based legal organization. And the focus of what we do is help people understand the process by which government decision-making happens in order to become more effective in interacting with government and in advocating for viewpoints related to government decisions. And so we do a lot of work around helping people understand how to access public information, understand the purposes of the Open Meetings Act and when government bodies can meet in open sessions versus closed sessions. We do a lot of education around tax increment financing districts, home rule kind of issues, access to the ballot. Essentially those kind of bread and butter issues that revolve around how communities operate and how residents of those communities can highlight issues of public concern. And so while we're a law office, we don't do individual representation as much as focus on local public policy issues and help people identify issues of concern and how to resolve those issues of concern. The other large portion of our work is, usually when I get phone calls at the center, the conversation starts with, can they, insert government entity, do that, insert whatever the issue is. And through multiple conversations and trying to kind of vet out what the issue of concern is, it usually comes down to a couple of things. Number one, a concern about the failure to adhere to a procedural process that government entities are maybe circumventing a public decision-making process and not allowing citizens to be heard, an avenue to be heard, or the process is being followed, but the public officials just aren't being responsive to the citizens in terms of their viewpoints and changing their minds about how they're going to vote on something depending on what the citizens are advocating for. And so then it becomes part of a, then what do you do kind of thing. And in our perspective, there's a couple of ways that we help people change public policy. You either, number one, convince those who are making the government decisions to change the way they're going to vote and be responsive to what your concerns are. You remove the people who are voting that aren't responsive to you and replace them with others who are. You go through a direct democracy avenue. In Illinois, we have a variety of referendums, binding and advisory referendum avenues that citizens can use to bypass going to elected officials to have a vote on a particular issue. However, that's very limited in Illinois, so sometimes that's useful, sometimes it's not. And number four, we are lawyers, so if all else fails, we may sue if there's a valid issue of concern. And so generally, when I sit down as a citizen group and they come to me and say, can they do that, whatever that may be, we kind of sit down and we help them figure out what is the issue of concern, what are the avenues available to address the concern, what's the procedure by which all these avenues have to be followed in order to get the result you want, and number four, which is what some of you are doing here tonight, how do you organize a campaign or a community group to keep issues of concern alive and have a presence in the community. And so that's kind of globally what our organization does and what we have been doing for 15 years. I've had the pleasure of working with this group for six, seven years,
yeah,
right?
2000,
years.
2003.
And I have to say that this organization is a rarity, because oftentimes what we see are citizens coming together when there's a hot community issue, and then when that issue resolves itself in one way or another, the momentum dies down and the community group kind of dies out. So the fact that you're still having meetings and that you're still monitoring agencies and expressing viewpoints is a big deal, because it's a lot of sweat equity, I like to say, to keep these organizations alive. I was asked to talk about two things. One is the commissioner form of government, and two, how do you keep this organization growing and visible and vibrant in the community. And so the first thing, you know, the commissioner, you have a commissioner form of government, and it's, you know, in some ways I think that it's, there are lots of different forms of government. In some communities, like in the city of Chicago, you have the city of Chicago that's divided into wards, and each ward has individuals who are responsive to the citizens for their piece of the pie in a community. And you have a mayor who has veto power over the city council, and it's much like in our civics class that we learned when we were in high school, kind of the president and Congress. In other communities that are smaller, where there is less resources to pay for administrative costs, there's we have commissioner form of governments, where essentially those who sit on the those who are the policy makers also engage in a lot of administrative work, which the mayor's here, and I'm sure he can tell you that he spends a lot of his time doing administrative work in addition to policy issues. And so that is one of the things that's very unique to the commissioner form of government that you have here, and one of the things that I find really interesting, because oftentimes when people come to us about issues, it's hard work to be a public official in my viewpoint, because you're never going to satisfy everybody. Someone's always going to disagree with you, which is fine. It's part of the job. But the other part of it is kind of the administrative task of executing the policy decisions. And so it's a very unique role that you have when you make the policy decisions, but then also are responsible for executing the policy decisions. So for example, in Forest Park, you have your 5 commissioners, and each commissioner is responsible for overseeing a specific area of government here in Forest Park. And so for the person that does your finance committee, that individual is involved in a lot of procurement issues that in another town that has that's divided into wards, or has a manager, a village manager, or a village administrator, would be responsible for executing a lot of the nuts and bolts associated with procurement contracts. And so I don't live in Forest Park, and I don't live in a commissioner form of government, so I'm not as intimately involved in it as all of you are. But certainly, from the perspective of being able to have an opportunity to do the policy and execution of administration, the commissioner form of government is unique. Some of the concerns with the commissioner form of government that we've heard is that because each organization, because each commission member is responsible for a particular division of government, there's concerns about, number one, do all the commissioners have a equally vested interest in the overall good of the community, or are they primarily concerned with kind of their piece of the pie in terms of the administrative responsibilities of the community, say public works, or finance, or property development, or whatever it is. So that's number one, is this idea of when you have each commissioner that's responsible for, what do you have? You have accountant finances, public health and safety, streets and public improvements, and public property. The alleged concern is whoever the commissioner is that's the head of accounts and finances, how invested are they in public health and safety and public property? The other concern, frankly, is that there's a lot of control that these commissioners have over how each of these commissions operate in terms of staffing decisions. And so the other concern is who are the hiring process, frankly, in terms of who works in these various commissions and how are the decisions made at the commission level. And that's fine, because that's, you know, we're in Illinois and corruption is always going to be an issue of concern. I'm not saying it's happening here in Forest Park, I'm just saying it's an issue of concern. The flip side, in terms of the benefits of the commission process, is that, again, you have the policymakers who are involved in the administration side of things. So they understand the consequences of policy decisions, which is frankly an issue that we hear all the time, is that public officials are a lot of times out of touch with the effect of their decision in the rest of the community. So in a way it brings you closer to the citizens that you represent. And second of all, frankly, it saves a lot of money because you don't have to hire as many administrators to execute the policies. So in terms of kind of broad issues related to the commissioner form of government, those are kind of the broad strokes. I know there were some questions about notice issues that I'd be happy. Does anyone have any? Well, let me back up. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
I don't know, how many commissioner types of government do we have in the state of Illinois?
I don't know how many are in the state of Illinois, but I can tell you that for a smaller size, for relatively small size communities like Forest Park, it's not an unusual form of government to have. It's not an unusual form of government to have. I can tell you that when we have some citizen groups come to us and are trying to figure out how do they deal with reforming whatever their issue of concern is, one of the things that they always think about is changing their form of government. And you know, there are pros and cons to changing your form of government, because some people really like the idea of having a community that's divided into wards, rather than having all of your commissioners elected at large, because they like the idea of having, you know, the one person or the two people who are responsive to their concerns that they can go to, that is supposed to be their advocate on the board. The flip side of that, I've talked to other individuals who say, you know what, I disagree with that. It's the village board represents the entire village. And even though I live on the north side of town, my issues in one way or another affect the entire community, and all the board members should be my advocate on a particular issue. So it's one of those things that it depends the viewpoint by which you see things. You know, it's not good or bad, it's just the way things are. Frankly, the other thing that affects form of government issues tangentially is this concept of home rule. Do you know what home rule is?
Some of us do.
Home rule doesn't necessarily affect the form of government as much as it affects the capacity of a community to tax, spend, and regulate beyond state statute. And so the other conversation that we have with a lot of people is this discussion around, is home rule good or bad for a community, and is it something that our community should evaluate, either trying to get or trying to repeal if you're already home rule. It essentially, it allows things like, you know, the city of Chicago is kind of a quintessential example of a home rule community in that you hear they're able to tax everything. You know, bottled water, for an example, is, you know, something that they can tax. And people identify home rule often with increased taxes. And in a way, that's accurate. However, the benefit to being a home rule community is you're able to resolve local issues of concern without necessarily having to drive down to Springfield and negotiate with legislators for the passage of some kind of legislation to help your community deal with an issue. And so it affects the form of government question because all of our communities are dealing with revenue, loss of revenue while we have increased spending. And so it's a direct correlation to how communities are able to finance their operations as well as regulate and spend money. I hope I didn't confuse you.
We did have a referendum for home rule some years back and it did not pass.
Yeah, I mean it's tough. I mean it's a tough. Normally, once a community becomes home rule, it's very difficult to repeal it because communities, you know, it's from people that we've talked about, the benefits that people perceive home rule to be is that it just gives a lot of freedom to a municipality to engage in conduct that it wouldn't otherwise be able to do in terms of raising taxes and spending and solicitation of contracts. The flip side of it is that it's totally dependent on your trust of public officials to use home rule responsibly. And so, for example, in the community where the center is located, DuPage County, there's this ongoing debate about, DuPage County, and when can it become home rule, and is it home rule because of how it's set up now, and all this other kind of thing. And there's a lot of conversations about, well, can we become home rule but limit ourselves in terms of how we execute that power? And it may be a crude reference, but I tell people it's like being pregnant. You either are or you're not. You can't be a little bit. And it's the same way with home rule. It's entirely dependent on do you trust your public officials to use that power wisely? And for some people, it's worth it. And for others, they say, you know what? I'd rather have the public officials come to the citizenry when they want to do things like set up a TIF district that's secured by my property taxes through a general obligation bond. I want my public officials to come to the public and ask our approval before they do that. Whereas in a home rule community, the public body doesn't have to do that. If they want to set up a TIF district and they want to fund it by general obligation bonds, they can do it without having to go to referendum.
Point of information, is that why River Forest has its own township? That they were attempting to have home rule? It's rather interesting, they are an entity within themselves.
Township government has nothing to do with home rule. Home rule is a fiction of municipalities and counties. Towns and counties. And Cook County is the only county in Illinois that's home rule right now. DuPage is trying really hard to become the second one. And in municipalities, I forget how many municipalities are home rule around the state, but it's not an unusual state for a community to be. And once you hit 25,000, you automatically become home rule. What's the population of Forest?
Just under 14.
14. So once you become 25,000, you automatically become home rule, and then you have to pass a referendum to repeal that power.
Terry, in Oak Park they have a president and trustees.
And a village manager.
Manager is elected village manager?
No.
Okay. So is that similar to like what Chicago has without having people elected for the
Well,
city?
it's the concept of having professional administrators versus public officials who are administrators by and large. I mean, and it's a difference between how much direct control do the trustees have over the operation of government.
That is the question.
What?
I said that is the question. We also have a village administrator, for 13 or so years, I think, late 90s. And sometimes I wonder how all that works together. And it's interesting you say that the commission reform was instituted in a major way to save money, to be economical or efficient. But we do have that other layer, so it's not a village manager type government.
But there is one,
But
too.
yeah.
But there is one to help the facilitation. Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing, every community is different. Every community is different. And the benefit of the village manager is that's kind of someone who has a grasp of everything that's going on, whereas the commissioners are responsible for their piece of the pie, and it helps in terms of consistency and in moving things forward, in terms of operation of government. And the village manager is hired by a majority vote of the village board.
You mentioned you didn't know how many, our newspaper says there's approximately 200 towns in the U.S. that have commissioner form of government.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that doesn't sound very common to me, but it doesn't, spread out within 50 states, it doesn't sound like a lot.
Well, I mean, to me, I think, number one, I think you have to think about what would you like to achieve? What would you like to, what are the goals by changing a form of government? Or just not even saying what kind of government you have. What's your ideal community look like in terms of the setup of your governors? That's the first question that I ask people, because the second thing is to change a form of government that's a binding referendum that has to be put on the ballot. And frankly, it's a lot of work, because it's kind of like changing the direction of a ship. It's not something that can happen instantaneously. And oftentimes, changing the form of government isn't necessarily isn't necessarily going to resolve the issues of concern a community has. More often than not, the problem that people have is who's in those positions rather than the setup of the commission form of government in and of itself. And so that's why when I talk with people, we sit down and we really think about, you know, what is distasteful to you, you know, about how this commissioner form of government is set up. What would you like to see that's different, and how would changing that form of government achieve those goals, as opposed to changing the people who are running the commissioner form of government. So, I mean, I know you guys have had a lot of talks about this about this issue in the past.
On and off, yeah.
On and off. And I mean, so what are some of the issues? I mean, it would help me if I knew what are some of the issues of concern that you all have related to this topic.
Well, actually, I don't think I don't really have a position. I was really here to
Figure
hear
it
the
out.
pros and the cons.
Yeah, I
Because
mean,
it's not a common form, and most people are not familiar with it.
yeah. Well, I mean, Mr. Mayor, do you have anything to add about? I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. From your perspective, I mean, there are pros and cons to the commissioner form of government. So what would you say?
I don't want to steal your thunder.
No. Go ahead. I mean, you know, the purpose of this is to have a dialogue about, you know, kind of.
Really, the significant difference, you know, there's only a handful of different forms of government.
Right.
And as Terry already pointed out, and the only significant difference between the commissioner form and all other forms, the balance of the forms, which were all established by state statute, is that in the commissioner form of government, the elected officials exercise legislative, executive, and administrative authority. That's a little bit different than the balance of the other forms. In all of the other forms of government, the elected officials, we qualify that. Other than the mayor, the balance of the elected officials only exercise legislative authority.
You mean presidents too with that, like in a
Well, for
VM?
example, you don't have veto power. Well, no, you don't have veto power.
I don't have veto power.
As opposed to
A president, which you're going to find typically a person holding the title of president is in a manager form of government.
Right.
That's a form of government. And so in that case, the president has veto power. So he can override, just like the President of the United States, he can override decisions that are made by the balance of the elected body. And of course, just as with both national politics, state politics, and then at the local level, you're going to have some type of legislation that was created to determine if the president vetoed some type of action, the rest of the body by some supermajority could override the veto of the president. So,
Thank you so much.
Does
I
that-
really,
does
no,
that
no,
sum
no.
up?
That really highlights it, and thank you so much. I mean, that's really the crux of it in terms of this concept of checks and balances related to the mayor's actions over a council, you know, or the rest of the body, or the mayor being part of, essentially having equal status as the rest of the commissioners plus a little bit more power. And so but it all gets back to, in my viewpoint, when you really have to get at the heart of, is it a systemic issue in terms of, does this form of government present systemic barriers to this organization or any other organization getting something done? Or does it have to do with a dislike of who are the people making the decisions? Because those are two very different issues. And frankly, your approach to resolving those issues is entirely different. Yes.
I have a question. I used to live in Oak Park, and I had a business in Oak Park. And if there were issues that came up, I had the ability to call the village attorney, make an appointment, go in and see him. Now, they have a trustee system with a president and a manager. In our community, with the commission form of government, the citizens are denied access the village attorneys. I've sent them emails, I get no replies. I know somebody that sent a letter. Everybody over at Village Hall, the attorneys got their undies in a bunch because, You know, why were they being contacted? And they were told, don't ever do this again. Is there a special privilege between a commissioned form of government and the village attorneys as opposed to what happens in Oak Park?
Yeah, you know, to me, that's not an issue of a form of government. To me, that's a policy issue of the community. I mean, I also know, I also know communities. I mean, number one, city attorneys are often, employees, or they're contracted by a municipality. And frankly, every time a citizen calls the attorney, cha-ching, 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 the billable hours start accruing. And so, in most communities, I'm actually really surprised that you were able to talk directly to a city attorney in a community, because most of the communities that we work with, there's not that kind of direct line of communication. In fact, in some of the communities that we do work in, the public officials themselves don't even have direct access to the city attorney. There has to be an approval process through the mayor in order to go to the city attorney and have a direct conversation with the city attorney outside of their presence at a community meeting, largely because of the billable hours issue.
Okay, so if it's a policy issue, should that policy be stated somewhere? Because this person that wrote a letter was just chastised. Should there be a policy that says, please do not communicate with the attorneys?
For clarification purposes, for
Yeah,
sure.
because it was, pretty disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that from if you're used to one thing and then you come to another community and it's something else. I mean, imagine being a public official and not being able to talk to the city attorney.
Yeah.
Which is something that we see a lot, and some of it has to do with just kind of the personality of the mayor in terms of kind of what their perspective is in terms of what should the role of the city attorney be. And some of it, frankly, is just a straight out fiscal issue in terms of community trying to keep down the costs.
Mhm.
I have a question about, it's kind of a parliamentary procedure question, I'm not sure if you know.
If I don't know it, I'll tell you I don't know, and I'll research it and get back to you.
Okay, we recently had a situation where something was on the agenda for discussion only. Okay.
Was it at the board? At the council meeting, okay.
At the meeting. And, as soon as the issue came, well, shortly after the issue came up, somebody in one of the commissioners made a motion for something, seconded, and then discussion ensued and such and such and such, and then there was a vote. And I always thought in order to vote, it had to say, ordinance or resolution on the agenda versus discussion.
Was it a specific title that said discussion items for discussion, and
It's
then
discussion on such and such topic.
discussion?
Like it named the topic.
Okay, that is a question that's more related to the Open Meetings Act, or that's how I would analyze that under. Under the Open Meetings Act is a state law that regulates the procedure by which how public bodies can conduct their business and when they can convene an executive session to discuss an issue. The agenda requirements of the Open Meetings Act are pretty horrible, because while on the one hand the statute mandates that a public body has to have an agenda, which is a really good thing because in some states there's not even that requirement. The problem is that the specificity with which the agenda items have to be detailed and the difference between discussion and action is very not favorable to the citizens. A matter of fact, a case just came out of the Second District, the Second District Appellate Court, which is our area of town out in the western suburbs, and the case had to do with Campton Hills, which is way out in Kane County. And in the village of Campton Hills, the municipality had on its agenda a title that said annexation, and then underneath it had the title properties for discussion and consideration of possible annexation. And that's all it said. It didn't have a specific property identified or anything. The municipality did a whole bunch of things, but related to this issue, they ended up going into an executive session to discuss this item number. They came out of executive session and they basically said, we vote to annex property XYZ All in favor? Yes. Those opposed? No. The citizen whose property was annexed filed a lawsuit against the village, one allegation being a violation of the Open Meetings Act, and the second district came out with a ruling that said that as long as the action that was taken by the public body was germane to something that was on the agenda, it was okay, which is really bad for, in our perspective, because that means, in our viewpoint, that public bodies can just issue shell agendas that basically say resolutions, ordinances, annexations, you know, and that's it. Essentially, they can issue agendas that really that don't convey any meaningful information. Unfortunately, this case was published, which means that the scenario that you're describing makes it very hard, very, very hard to win a lawsuit if someone were to file a lawsuit saying, you know, this is ridiculous. This agenda says that this item was for discussion. Had we known that you intended to take action on this, maybe someone would have come to the meeting and made public comment, who otherwise, you know, wouldn't have done it. But according to the second district, which this is the latest decision on a line of cases on this issue, it's considered to have a lot of weight. So this is a problem that if you're all looking for an issue to go down to Springfield and lobby about, this might be a good one. Agenda requirements for the Open Meetings Act. So I would say best practices, absolutely not. Legal, probably.
Terrible.
Well, you know, oftentimes, you know, these issues that we work on come down to, does it comply with the spirit of the law or does it comply with the letter of the law? And oftentimes, what complies with the letter of the law is in conflict with what the spirit of the law is. And that's why the work that you do is so important, because it really forces you to sit down and think about what is the purpose of our organization? What are the primary issues that we're concerned about in the broad scheme of things? And what are the actions that we can take to slowly move towards our mission and goals? Are there any other questions? Yes?
Before I'm Marty Tellalian, I should identify myself. I'm a commissioner in Forest Park. And actually this thing that Gloria asked about was a situation where we previously had a closed session discussion about a topic. It was placed on open session. We discussed it. It was about a piece of public property. And what happened in that case was, during that discussion, motion was made to make the mayor the sole contact for the sale or use of that public property, which is really takes away, is I guess you could say it's an amendment or a change to our actual village code that provides that responsibility to me. So that in this discussion, essentially what they did was modify our ordinances and take this piece of property away from it. And whether that's legal or not, maybe that's probably deeper than what we can get into here tonight. But one of the things that I wanted your comments on, the research that I've done, and people I've talked to said that actually the commission form of government, the mayor is really not, it's not a strong mayoral type of government.
No.
It's actually a very relatively weak mayoral form of government. But we have a situation where, you know, obviously, as it's often said, 3 beats 2 every time. And we do have, you know, it breaks into cliques. I'm sure it happens on all councils, but certainly that's been an unfortunate element of Forest Park politics for a while now, previous terms and this term. And, you know, is there a way in which we can, you know, how does a commissioner that feels like he is being overstepped and having his duties and responsibilities that are a part of the form of government and within our code being taken away?
Right. So let me make sure I'm understanding your question. So your question is acknowledging that the commissioner form of government in and of itself really has the mayor essentially being one of 5, plus a couple of extra powers and duties. What happens when the political dynamics are such that there are actions taken that give more power to the mayor than may be appropriate under this form of government. Is that essentially what the
Yes,
question
that's
is?
the question too, and I guess the other part of it too is that there is, you know, the mayor does have a general administrative responsibility, and oftentimes that's cited as the, at least, well, I wouldn't say cited, I know that there's obviously disagreements from time to time on what that entitles the mayor to do, and how much it allows him to overstep, or not overstep, that puts my bias in it, but actually how it allows him to get involved in administrative
Have
affairs.
increasing power and duties.
Yes.
How about that? Is that
Pardon me?
fair? Have increasing power and duties?
Well,
maybe?
to not increasing power, but have administrative, to use that general administrative responsibility to actually take administrative control of public property, public works, public safety, and accounts and finance.
Well, off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'd be happy to take a look at it and we can exchange some information and I can get back to you. I mean, I think it's an interesting question from the perspective of, you know, if the mayor has these general oversight responsibilities, but yet individual commissioners are responsible for a very small universe of operations within a community, how does that general power conflict with very specific powers related to this one area? That's a really good question because, I mean, if you look at in case law and in litigation, you often look to rules of statutory interpretation, you know, and generally speaking, the more specific language regarding explicit duties override the more general descriptive duties of responsibilities. I'm not saying that that applies to your scenario, but what I'm saying is that in the broad scheme of things, when you do an analysis of powers and duties, unless someone has litigated this issue, frankly, and there's been a court decision, the thing that you would look at is, you know, what are the statutory interpretations of how Illinois state statute, which defines this universe of form of government, how does it define it? But that's a great question. You know, I'm happy to do some research.
And from what I've read, the courts have, and I think it is that specific nature that our duties are very specifically spelled out. And from what I've been able to dig up, not being an attorney or anything, that
Right.
the courts have generally ruled in favor of commissioners.
Right, because it has to do with, you have a very specific realm of duties as opposed to a very general role of duties as it relates to general administration. And, you know, and then it becomes an issue of, you know, is there the political will to kind of take that fight on, you know, in terms of the village government and what happens there? Or do you want to change the people who are, you know, giving this extra power to the mayor and doing the 3-2 vote? I mean, or do you want to sue to hold these ordinances invalid? Because you are not home rule. This is one of the benefits of not being home rule. When you are not home rule, the actions of what happens here is bound by the confines of Illinois statutes. Okay? When you are home rule, you can tax, spend, and regulate yourself beyond the confines of Illinois statutes. And we get a lot of calls from people saying, I live in a home rule community and my community constantly violates its own ordinances. What do I do? And those communities are really in a hard spot because there's not a whole heck of a lot that they can do. But in communities that are non-home rule, because you have this cap of state law, you have many more options available to you because there is definitely an avenue of recourse. So let's exchange information at the end of this, and that's something that I can get back to you on. Yeah?
Would you also talk about how this situation would be handled if we had warrants? Let's say that the community had warrants.
I don't think that situation would be any different if you had.
The situation would be any different? What would happen in that case? And the mayor would, because we.
Oh, well, if you had, well, generally speaking, the ward form of government, the forms of government that have wards can have this checks and balance power where the mayor can have more responsibilities as opposed to being an equal commission member plus a couple of more
Well,
duties.
let's say if village property, land. In other words, let's take the same thing with village land. What would they do in that case?
Well, I guess I'm not understanding. You mean, could the community pass an ordinance that says, we want to give the mayor contracting power or negotiation power for a parcel of property. Could the
And
council
that
do
would
that?
be what they might do in a community that had wards?
I think she may be asking, is the person in charge of, say, Ward 1, in charge of everything to do with Ward 1,
No.
like property and,
No.
I think that may be the question, I'm
No.
not sure.
Well-
No, the answer to, if that's what you're getting at, no. I mean, you know, an alderman for Ward 1 isn't responsible for,
Everything.
you know,
Ward one.
if Avenue J wants sidewalks and they don't have sidewalks, it's not Alderman from Ward 1's responsibility to get the sidewalks put into, you know, Avenue
But
J.
in the case if the property happened to be in Ward 1, then it would be what? What would the ward?
It would be treated, there's no specific responsibility to that ward member to deal with that property.
Public property.
Correct.
Well, in Chicago, a couple years ago, with the Children's Museum going in Grant Park, that was a big fight between the alderman and the,
Right, but
And
that's
the
a
mayor.
political, it's a political issue, it's not an issue of Ward 1 is my fiefdom, and so, I mean,
Okay, thank you.
that's an issue more of, that's a I would define that as a political issue in terms of, are there the votes there from the council as a whole to get what Ward 1 aldermen want done, rather than Ward 1 is the responsibility of this alderman, and they need to do whatever needs to be done to resolve issues of concern in that ward.
okay,
There's no mandate,
okay.
but those are really good questions, yeah.
Just kind of following up on something Marty started, is it
Those papers.
determinable, or can we determine maybe through the legal aspects whether, let's say in the case of where there's 5 commissioners and 3 vote to do something, and if the overall form of government says each one is responsible for X, Y, Z, and each one has its own little area, whether they have the legal right to say, well, we just voted to give the mayor or anybody
Well,
else.
that's the question that he's asking. Yeah, that's the question that he's asking, and I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to research it and find it. I mean, you know, we constantly have, a couple of years ago, we had an issue where we did some work in, can't remember which municipality it was in, I think it might have been Chicago Heights, Harwood Heights. And the situation they had there is they had a mayor and they had a council, and the council was kind of continually passing ordinances to kind of chip away at the mayor's power. And so there it was kind of the inverse in terms of the question was, could the council keep passing these ordinances that keep taking away the power of the mayor to essentially be just a figurehead and have no powers. And this question is kind of the opposite of that in some ways. And they're tough questions because really you have to look at what's the statutory interpretation of what Illinois law says. And if there are not any published cases definitively giving guidance, then it basically comes down to what's the opinion of the village attorney, and is there the political will for those who disagree with that interpretation to take action to change
And
what's
if there is
happening.
even case law, it's still up to the individual.
Well, if there's case
township.
law, then you can make the argument that what you're doing doesn't comport with Illinois statute and all these bad things can happen, but that requires someone to be able to back up what those bad things
Yeah.
Finance.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, I mean, when with the work that we do, you know, we view litigation as an avenue of last resort because it's very costly, it's very time consuming, and oftentimes by the time the litigation is resolved, there's been a changeover in kind of who the public officials are, and so, you know, that's just kind of the nature of the beast, and so that's why, you know, we always tell people, if there is a valid legal issue there, that's definitely an option, but you really have to look at what are the other avenues, because you know, frankly, it might be you could spend less money and in a shorter period of time to turn over the council versus litigate this case that it may be iffy. You may be right, but if you get a bad judge or, you know, and all these other kind of things, you never know what's going to happen.
We've seen them strip people of power before with the curb cut issue.
Yeah, it was taken away
It
from,
belonged to one commissioner, and the council voted to make it a council decision and took it away from them.
Yeah, that's an interesting, I mean, I'd be happy to research it for you.
Well,
Yeah.
what's interesting, you know, when you just said what was happening in Harwood Heights, where the council was stripping the mayor, but the mayor sets the agenda. So
Right.
how did they must have
Yeah,
really
I
had a
mean,
way to get it on the agenda.
well, you know, I mean, it's the situation where, I mean, I guess I shouldn't say they were chipping away, that they engaged in a lot of activity with the ordinances that posed a lot of questions of, could they really do that? Could they really do that? Just like the question that you have. And, you know, like, for example, one of the things they did there is the council, the village had a village attorney, and the council ended up hiring their own attorney. And so you had the situation where you had the council's attorney attending cases, you know, meetings, and then you had the village attorney attending. And it just was kind of this constant fight of what was the, you know, the council's attorney said one thing, you know, and the village attorney maybe had a different opinion, and then you kind of get into, you know, these questions of resources and, you know, the way the case law reads, you know, it's a question of, well, how long can a council have their own attorney? You know, most of the stuff identifies it as for special circumstances rather than in perpetuity. And so then it kind of got into this question of, can they do that? You know, and who do you listen to, and how does this work? And, you know, and so that's why a lot of these things, they're really good, meaty questions, because it really gets people to think about. I mean, think of these conversations that we're having here. Who has conversations? Nobody has conversations.
come to our house, come to our house.
Right. No, but I'll get to your. But these are good questions to have, because it really gets at the question of, this is what the law says in terms of how our community is supposed to operate. These are the responsibilities of the individual people. How much, what activity has to be taken to cross that line? And how far do you have to cross that line before it becomes a clear violation? You know, kind of, there are lots of shades of gray. And at what point does it go too far? Yes?
You brought up the dueling village attorneys. Is there a statute, what, the village or the city attorneys, what is their,
Duties and responsibilities?
yes, I mean, what is their, whose agent are they?
Who do they represent?
Who do they represent?
Well, they represent the corporate authorities. That's who they represent. They're hired by the which is your village
Right.
council. They're hired by a majority vote of the village, and their purpose is to provide legal advice and guidance to the corporate authorities.
The elected officials.
As a whole.
Right.
Yes?
I just have a question. When they hire a, dueling attorney, who pays for the second?
Yeah, the citizens. It's the citizens, yeah.
They're big, so.
Yeah, it made for really interesting meetings, I can tell you. Yeah.
You were talking about how to like expand like our group and our organization, but I think that a lot of people in the community are concerned about our government. And if you were to like read the Forest Park Review and see like citizen comments about, commissioners taking advantage and like kind of breaking the rules that we already have established. And you can see the people being frustrated in their comments, but it's like, I think our question is like, at least mine, being on the board, is how do we get out to them and how do we reach them?
How do you tap into that?
Yeah, and like how do you, like obviously you're saying if people, it's not the form of government, it's who's in the powers of the seats. And there's people out there that all have the same feeling that we might when we see something like abused.
So what
But I don't know like how to like kind of reach out to people because they're not like leaving their names, they're not saying like contact me to like, make a change. They're
Yeah,
like,
I mean, I think that, that's a really good question. It's a pretty, kind of bread and butter question of how do you grow an organization, right? Well, the benefit that you have right now is that this organization has been around for a while. And so what I think you need to do is take a look at what were the original purposes for this organization being established. I mean, I think that's the first thing you have to do is kind of this reflection of why is this organization here? Are the reasons for why this organization was initially set up still still valid? Because maybe this organization initially started because of a community development issue, essentially. Are those issues of concern still valid? What are the issues of concern in the community? I mean, I think you really need to look at a couple of things. Number one, what do you want this organization to be? What do you want it to be? Do you want it to be primarily an agency of monitoring government agencies? Do you want it to be an organization that provides training and resources to people in Forest Park about how to become civically engaged? Do you want this organization to be an advocacy organization where not only do you identify problems in the community, but a crucial component that we feel is absolutely necessary when you're doing policy community organizing is being able to make solid recommendations for reform. You know, so do you want to engage in advocacy that not only includes kind of analyzing an issue that's going on, but making recommendations for reform? Or do you want to do all three of those things? I think that's the first thing you need to think about is what do you want to do as an organization? Once you figure out what you want to do, I think the next thing you need to think about involves what are the resources of the organization. The benefit of being around 6 years is that you have some name recognition. You have some kind of relationship with people all around town, for better or for worse. You know, they might. And number three, you have some idea of how decision making happens here in Forest Park. You know, you can't affect policy change unless you understand the process by which decision making happens. You know, so you need to really think about what are the resources in your community that you have to harness. And then, you know, frankly, what I would do if I were you guys is I would hold a working session and I would just make a list of what are all the issues of concern that you guys have in the community and just brainstorm all of them. Don't kind of restrict yourself in terms of that's silly or that's old or whatever. Because what's going to happen when you kind of do this brainstorming list is that you're going to find natural clusters of issue. You're going to find a cluster maybe that has to do with economic development, a cluster that has to do maybe, I don't know, with affordable housing or whatever. Once you kind of identify what are the issues of concern that this organization wants to deal with, then what you can do is you can start working with the press. You start having those individual conversations with people when you're all out and about in the community, and one by one, it's kind of it's a campaign. It's a campaign. It's a lot of one-on-one conversations. Go back to those lists of people who were initially involved in the organization, however long ago. Bring them back in the fold, at least in terms of educating them about, look, these are the issues that we've identified that we're taking on. These are our short-term goals. These are our long-term goals. I mean, so before you can start attracting people to the organization, I think you need a very specific and strategic sense of what you want to engage in terms of the kind of activities as an organization, and what are the issues of concern you want to address. And I think once you have those two things, it's going to be much easier to go out and talk to people in the community about, you know, what happens. You know, one of the things that we tell people to do is, you know, I don't know if a lot of people make public comment in the community, but oftentimes when people show up to City Hall, you know, when they give public comment, they have to give their name and address, and, you know, someone should be monitoring meetings and kind of making outreach to those people who give public comment. Someone should be, you know, Steve's been doing a good job of documenting what's going on in the community and how can you use that for promotional purposes. But you can't do any organizational building until, as an organization, you have a really good sense of what are the purposes in terms of your main objectives, and what are the issues that you want to address. And I'm happy to facilitate a workshop like that. If that's something you guys want to do.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask, do you have like a little book or a manual or something like that?
It's all up here. No. I mean, we call it an advocacy training. I mean, it's very, you know, essentially what we do is, you know, it's very simple. I mean, we don't have to do it. You guys can do it. It's very simple. You just sit down and you think, what are all of the issues of concern you have in the community? And just brainstorm them. You know, just don't inhibit yourself. What are all the issues of concern you have in the community? What are all the resources this organization has available to it? And it can be people resources, money resources, knowledge resources, anything, okay? What are the actions, what kind of activity does this group want to engage in? What do you want to do? Do you want to monitor government meetings? Do you want to, conduct voter registration and do civic engagement? What are the activities this organization wants to do? And then, and then essentially you kind of go through and then you'll prioritize. By virtue of making this list, natural priorities will come to the surface. And then essentially you set short and long-term goals.
Well, what happens if you're still fighting the same issues 7 years later and they're just not, people,
Well, then
they
you have to
lose
think
their...
about why are you fighting the same issues? Because then it may become an issue of you got to change the people who are making the decisions to be responsive. And then that's an entirely different organizing. I mean, then you're talking about a political campaign,
Well,
which is entirely different.
they just stopped being sexy. I mean, nobody wants to talk about the failures of the Open Meetings Act. Nobody wants to belabor the fact that we're not getting FOIAs. Nobody wants to belabor the fact that the students, people have lost interest.
Right.
And for the last 2 years, there's been no activity along those lines.
Well, I think, right, because process-based issues aren't sexy.
No, they're not.
Right? I mean, they're not, but that's why I think what you need to do is make those process-based issues directly related to personal issues that people are dealing with in the community. So, I mean, I don't know what a kind of a hot community issue is right now or a community issue that has a lot of visibility. But if there are these FOIA issues and OMA issues, undoubtedly those issues are going to present themselves regardless of what issue is hot in the community. And is that clear? I mean, the process-based issues, access to government information, access to government meetings, if you're saying that those are still barriers, those barriers are going to be there no matter what the issue of concern is. And so how you make it sexy is you tie it to the current issue.
Yeah, I mean, we've been fighting the same zoning issues. That's what brought us into this whole thing in 2000.
Right, but you can't, but you know what, that's too amorphous. People
Yeah.
don't, I mean, it's like talking about campaign finance reform. Nobody wants to hear about campaign finance. They don't want to think about their own finances. They don't want to think about the finances of somebody else, But when you tie it to an issue of, this is how this campaign finance issue relates to your dinner table issue, and you can connect the dots for people, that's how you can get people engaged.
Can you hang on 1 second? I'm just gonna...
Did change their policy years back and did start putting things on the website.
Right.
Not only notice of meetings, but also the information, because it was getting difficult to go. We were getting restricted to go and look at documents in terms of zoning and planning issues.
Okay.
So then there was one zoning meeting that wasn't posted. This was a while back. And as a consequence of that not being posted, when it was brought to the attention of the village, they put that notice that we just gave you a copy
Yeah,
of.
disclaimer.
A disclaimer that they didn't have to.
Right.
And, at the time, those of us who saw it, we just had so many other things going, we didn't have the time to really analyze if this is correct. So if they could really say, well, we don't have to do this according to the Open Meetings Act for zoning and planning and other commissions. I'm not talking about the village council meetings, I'm talking about the other commissions.
Yeah, the way the Open Meetings Act states that when a public body has a person who's dedicated full-time to dealing with a public body website, they have to post agendas. They have to post notice provisions on the website. But, again, because the Open Meetings Act is tremendously weak in Illinois, later on in the statute, it says that failure to post is not deemed to be a substantial violation of the statute. So even if the community has a full-time person dedicated to the website, and they should be posting notices, and they don't, it's not considered a fatal flaw under the statute to invalidate what happened at the zoning board meeting.
Well, it's interesting, we had a week ago for the zoning meeting, they didn't post it in time, and people showed up, and it was brought to the attention of the chairman of the zoning board. He asked for an opinion from the village attorney representative there, and the village attorney representative there said, yes, it should have been posted. And then he must have gotten his hand slapped because now they're backpedaling and saying they don't have to do it again.
Yeah, well, it should be posted.
Yeah.
I mean, it should be. You know, the Open Meetings Act says that if there's a website and if there's a person dedicated to maintaining the website, a public body should post it.
Well, apparently we have two because they didn't post a meeting that should have been posted, Good Friday weekend. And the two people responsible for the website both took Good Friday off, so nothing got posted.
Right.
And their argument was that, well, the two people in charge, weren't here, so it didn't get posted.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's one of those things that the law is pretty straightforward in terms of they should have posted it, but unfortunately, the statute is also pretty weak in saying that even if they should have posted it and failed, it's not a strong enough violation of the statute to invalidate actions that happened at the meeting.
I think at the most part is just get the damn thing up there. I don't
Yeah,
think
I mean,
people
it's
want
one of
anything
these issues of, does it
invalidated.
violate the letter of the law or the spirit of the law?
Right.
It's that.
Yeah, they're letter people in this town.
So in the spirit of the law, Mayor, could we please get these things posted regularly, including all the supporting documentation that we were seeing for a while, in the spirit of the law? I ask you that today, you don't have to answer, but I just reported it because this stuff is done. I think it would be really
We have time for one more question, yeah.
You may have already answered the question with your comments about the Open Meeting Act being relatively vague, but one of the issues that we've had on our council, primarily because of my persistence or stubbornness or whatever, is the content of meeting minutes. And there was recently a situation that if I can explain it to you
Sure.
and shortly make sense of it, get your comment on it. There was an ordinance that we were considering for a zoning variation for a specific property. And I made a motion to amend that, to add a little bit of a requirement to that. And it was seconded, the amendment was seconded. It was defeated by a vote of 3-2. And then the minutes reported that an amendment was made to the ordinance and gave a paragraph, but was defeated by 3-2. The minutes only said that an amendment was made and never identified what that amendment was.
Right.
Now you get into the law where it says it has to identify the actions taken.
Right.
And it certainly seemed that minutes that just say that an amendment was made that was defeated does not meet the Open Meetings Act. I don't think it does, but obviously others on the council think that it does.
Right.
What's your opinion on something?
My opinion on something like that are issues related to meeting minutes are largely political issues. Political issues meaning they're only as good as the majority vote. In terms of the minutes are only as accurate as the majority vote who wins the vote. We get a lot of calls about people saying the minutes do not accurately reflect or do not fully reflect the content of the discussion. The Illinois Open Meetings Act does mandate that government bodies keep minutes, which is good because in a lot of states there's not that provision. No meeting minutes need to be kept. What we advise public officials to do is it's much easier to be proactive and specifically make a request for what you would like seen in the minutes rather than try and win a vote to amend the minutes. So what we've suggested to people, which have had very good results, is to say, if you suspect that there's going to be or there has been issues with the minutes, to dictate to the clerk, saying, clerk whoever, please let the minutes specifically reflect that the issue, X, Y, Z, because it's much easier to do that rather than to try and make a motion and win a motion to amend the minutes.
It seems like when our little church organization, we even say the minutes were read and either accepted or accepted as amended. And sometimes somebody will put up and say, I don't accept the minutes as written because so-and-so did this and not so-and-so, or they didn't write what they did. And the personal secretary will write it in and then.
That's not the way it is with the government aspect. There has to be a specific motion to amend, and the motion has to be seconded, and it has to be approved in order to amend the minutes.
No, but I just wanted to say, I tried that approach working with the clerk, but the clerk was given instruction to minimize the content of the minutes, and when I tried to talk to her about it, I don't think that's sufficient. She doesn't want to get involved and said, well, that's up to the council, bring it up to the council. And then,
Well,
so
you
that really
know,
doesn't
Yeah, I mean, that's why by and large these are political issues, and that the minutes are only as good as what the majority votes in. Now, in some communities where that they have commissions that vet out issues and give recommendations to a full council prior to a vote, we recommend that the minutes that come out of those commissions have essentially what we call a minority report, which is the viewpoint of those that didn't really vote at the commission level, because it's a way to be part of the formal minutes without having to be adopted. So essentially, it's a minority report, but it's a way to document dissent essentially.
Last thing, is that something that would be too trivial for the public access counselor to bring forth?
I think what the public access council, well, you can always, I mean, it doesn't cost you anything to file an appeal with the public access counselor. I mean, that's what they're there for. Anybody can make a request to the public access counselor. My suspicion is that they'd come back and say, as long as the minutes have the vote taken and the issue discussed, they probably are valid under the Open Meetings Act.
And that issue can just be, the ordinance was discussed and defeated, or this
Right.
amendment, move to amend the ordinance.
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on, I mean, I would say, if you have the time to file the appeal to the public access counselor, it doesn't cost you anything to do it, and it's certainly worth it to do it, because at a minimum, what the public access counselor may say is, these minutes obviously aren't as good as they could be. They may send someone out to do a training for your village board, or you could request someone. What's that?
I don't think that's the issue.
Okay, well.
They've been expertly trained.
They've been expertly trained, okay. Well, I guess the bottom line is that it doesn't cost you anything to file the appeal. And if you want help in filing that appeal and writing that, we'd be happy to help you do that.
Yeah, the content has been cut almost in half. I had a property owner that requested a disc from a zoning meeting, and then a week or so later he requested the disc where they approved something at the council meeting from 2004. So I went through the minutes to find out, whatever, and it's really been cut. Points of view and everything have all been cut.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a problem, because when, these issues, nothing happens in a vacuum, and these issues always come up again a couple of years later. That's why it's so important that this group is here, because we have some institutional history of how the community operates. And 5-10 years down the line, when someone wants to come back and take a look at, oh yeah, that project on whatever street happened, let's pull the minutes and see what happened. Essentially, the minutes are useless. Useless. Because it doesn't give you an idea of what happened. You don't know the content of the amendment.
Yeah, but in fairness to the other side, we are posting video of the meetings on the website.
Yeah.
Not everyone has access to that form of
Right, but the problem is that those aren't the
but we
official,
are doing
that's
that,
not the
which is
official,
very significant.
that's not the official documentation of what happens. And if those meetings are archived someplace, like at the library, that's great. That's fantastic, because, that would be the natural place to go to follow up, to get a sense. Yes?
Terry, in fairness to the minority being heard, me tonight, could you perhaps share if you have any familiarity with respect to meeting minutes? At least in our community, the meeting minutes are compiled and produced by a certified municipal clerk. And it's my understanding that it's the municipal clerk that prepares the meeting minutes pretty much in all municipalities.
Right.
And so they're the ones that are actually responsible for, the abbreviated content
Right.
that make up the minutes. And so my question is, do you have any experience in looking at municipalities that you may have worked in or around over a period of time where there have been changes in the person serving as the municipal clerk?
Oh, well, sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, of course, if the different clerks have different viewpoints of how much information has to go into minutes, is that what you're getting at?
Yes.
Of course,
Yes.
of course, that's personality driven to a certain extent. That being said, it's the responsibility of the board to approve the content of those minutes ultimately. And that's why when there's any kind of conflict, whether you think the minutes are too verbose because you don't need 4 pages to describe a 5-minute conversation, or there's not enough meat on the bones, that's why I think that it's important to be proactive and respectably request certain information be included. But yeah, of course, a lot of this stuff is personality driven.
So you've seen different styles by
sure.
different municipal clerks?
Right, sure, yeah.
Well, can a board or council vote to ask a clerk or whoever's, to document more healthily? Or is the clerk?
Well, the clerk could say, these are the, present the minutes to the board, and the board approves the minutes.
Okay.
It's ultimately the board's responsibility to approve what the documentation is for that meeting.
Could you send it back? Could the board send it back and say, oh, this is way too skimpy? Come back, fill
Of
this
course they
out?
could. Of
Okay.
course, I mean,
Okay.
of course
So-
they do. I mean, ultimately, it's the responsibility of the board
Gotcha, right.
in
Because
terms
they
of
approve
what
it.
is the documentation in those minutes.
So if there's a road clerk, then it's the board's job to make sure that they,
Right, or if it's a clerk that, puts in every sentence, yeah.
we don't elect a clerk here. How do we get our clerks?
And it's appointed, right? Isn't it appointed by a majority of the board?
So okay. Interesting.
The other issue that we've seen with meeting minutes, and then we can go, is this idea of clerks who bring a video or an audio recorder.
Yeah.
Right, and then people make a FOIA request for the audio recorder when the minutes don't jive with what happened in the meeting, and then you have lots of issues with that. But here, because you do video document the meetings, that's not an issue. But in communities that don't video document, that often becomes this issue.
Well, that video documentation is really
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
it's good.
So I'm happy to stick around and talk. If my contact information is, we're Citizen Advocacy Center. You can just Google us or grab me and I'll give you one of my cards, and I'm happy to talk about anything else. Thank you.
Terry,
You
thank you.
guys-